Welcome to Perfect Inspiration. My name's Colby Brown. I want to thank Brian and On One Software for allowing me to be the guest host this week. And today's focus is going to be on simplifying your composition. So why don't we go ahead and get started? I think when it comes to landscape photography, I think most photographers get wrapped up in the beauty of a given scene. Most of us kind of reach for our ultra-wide angle lenses, trying to grab everything into our frame. But the problem with that is that it complicates our images, or at least has the possibility to. And I've found lately that more times than not, I'm reaching for one of my lenses that allows me to get a little bit closer to my subjects, to get a little bit more focused on my composition so that I can remove some of these distracting elements rather than try to bring in all the details of a beautiful place like Iceland. So you can see the images that we have selected here are from the Gullfoss waterfall in Iceland, one of the more popular options to visit. And what I did when I got to the scene is that I was quite amazed by just the sheer magnitude of this waterfall. It's quite massive if you've ever been there. And so what I did is I pulled out my 24-70 lens and I started playing around with different compositions. Now, for those that haven't been there, this massive waterfall kind of feeds into this river, and then you have these kind of walls on both sides of this canyon as it runs downstream. And above it, there's not really any big hills or whatnot. It's actually kind of open sky. And I was there for sunset with some friends, but the sky didn't change the colors that I really wanted to. So instead, I wanted to still capture the beauty of this scene and the glacier kind of blues and greens in the water. And I wanted to bring all the elements together, but I didn't want to complicate my scene. So as I started walking back and forth from the walkway, I started playing around with different compositions that was gonna achieve this, and bringing in the elements of the water and it running off into the waterfall, the mist coming over the other side of the canyon, and the river running down this canyon as well. I wanted all those elements together. I myself am not a very prolific shooter, and by that I mean that I don't shoot thousands and thousands of images every time I pick up my camera. I'm actually very selective. So I can go to a place like Iceland for 2 weeks and come back with maybe 1,200 images, but in reality I probably only shot 100 or 200 different subjects, but just in a variety of different ways. Usually do a lot of bracketing and whatnot. So for this, I was very captivated by this waterfall. I'm trying different compositions to find the one that really brings all those elements together. It removes the distractions and really exemplifies the magnitude and just the atmosphere of being at this location. And after shooting for a good 15 minutes, I kind of came to one of these images that really personified Gullfoss, and it was this one. It really brought everything together. There's still a few little distracting elements that we will talk about removing here in just a second, but it was a great start. And this was shot with a Nikon D800, so it has quite an expanded dynamic range, as you can tell from the details that you can see in the shadows right now. So why don't we go ahead and start editing this image. We're going to start off in Lightroom. Now, the first thing that I generally do when I get here is I zero out my sharpening. Now, the reason for this is that I think sharpening for my workflow process happens at the very end, and Lightroom feels the need to have a default set at 25 sharpening, and I really don't like that. So we're actually going to zero this out, just so we don't have to deal with it. You can also create a preset. I usually have that set up on one of my other machines where I import images, and it applies a preset which basically flattens out the sharpening as well as a few of the other different variables that it automatically applies. Now for this image, we're not actually going to be doing a ton because it was actually captured very well in the sense of what I was hoping to get out of the image. But we do want to bring out some of the colors, we do want to add a little bit of contrast, and we do want to make sure that we're highlighting specific elements of this image. So let's go ahead and we're going to add a little bit of contrast. As you can see, that's basically making the whites whiter and the darks darker. And we're going to come down here and we're going to add just a touch of clarity. We won't too much because we're actually going to do more of that with On One Software Perfect Effects here in just a second. Now what I also want to do is I want to increase the vibrance a little bit. Now vibrance increases the kind of punch of color for most color hues aside from those that are kind of the reds and the oranges. The reason for that is that you can actually use it for portrait images of Caucasian people. usually when you increase saturation for a portrait with a Caucasian individual, it will make them turn into a tomato. So vibrance is a great option for it, and I like to use it in my landscape work as well because it becomes very subtle. I'm not going to touch saturation because we're not going to worry about it at this point. We're going to come down here to our tonal curve. I'm actually just going to use the sliders to make our lives simple. So I'm actually going to pull back on the highlights just a little bit, just because I want to bring back some of the details of the area right here as the water is cascading into the canyon. And then I'm also going to just increase a tiny bit of the darks because I want a little bit more shadow detail in the area over here. Now as we come down here, I like to apply the profile corrections, which is basically just giving it a more realistic look to the human eye, to kind of taking away from distortion and any potential vignetting. And everything else looks pretty good. So let's actually go ahead and jump into Photoshop now. Okay, so as I mentioned, we really want to take advantage of the perfect effects in order to really kind of bring this image to match my creative vision. So what we first need to do is I want to take away one of the distracting elements that I wasn't able to compose and remove, which is this corner right here. Now what we're just going to do is it's going to be very simple. We're just going to use the crop tool in Photoshop. We're going to keep the original ratio because I prefer that look, and we're actually just going to pull up from the bottom right hand corner just enough to get rid of it. Now I'm just going to move it down just so that we have the right balance for where I want, and there we go. So there, it's removed. It's very simple, very straightforward. Don't have to worry about it anymore. Again, the privilege of shooting with the D800 is that it's 36 megapixels, so removing a few small pixels, just as we just did, isn't that big a deal, even if we're blowing this image up quite big. So let's go ahead and open up Perfect Effects 4. Alright, so here we go. All the effects are on our left. I'm sure if you guys are watching Perfect Inspiration, you guys are pretty familiar when it comes to On1 software. Really great setup, really easy to use. I love the fact that you can actually paint and mask, which we'll play around in just a second. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I want to add a little bit of pop, a little bit of depth. Now one of my favorite things to do is actually go to the HDR preset and click on the HDR Look Surreal. Now, if you look at the image now, it's just kind of way completely overdone. This is certainly not what I had in mind. The amount is set to 100, which we don't want, so we're actually going to scale this back quite significantly. Now, all I want to do is apply just a touch of it. Now, all this is doing is basically just allowing a few of the, pulling out details kind of all over this image just to give it a little bit more pop. Now, I think like 12 looks about right where we want to, so we're going to go ahead and click Add, add that layer in. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to come over here to the landscape section, and we're going to move down to one of my favorite sliders, which is radiance as well as a preset. Now radiance is kind of darkening, adding a little bit of smoothness to some of the rougher areas, but it's darkening the image a little bit more than I want to. So again, we're just applying just a small amount. As you can see, kind of the darker areas are getting dark. It's also adding a tiny bit of almost like gloss or glow-like feel to the image, really allowing it to pop out for the color hues with the glacier water. Now what I also want to do, and a nice fun little trick here, is to use the portrait settings. Now we want to do portrait enhance. Now what I'm thinking about doing with portrait enhance is just pulling out some more of the colors of the kind of earth tones that are happen to be up on the moss on the right hand side of this image. So let's kind of come down here and let's go ahead and go to portrait color boost. Now it's just pulling out just a little bit, and we can actually adjust these as we need. There we go, it's getting rid of a little of that blue contrast. Let's go ahead and click here to yellow. Let's increase some of the saturation, which is just allowing these to pop just a little bit. And let's go ahead and add this layer in. Now another way that you can do this is that you can actually use the golden hour enhancer. So let's go ahead and type this in, golden. Now with the golden hour enhancer, what we've done is we basically brought out more of the warmer tones, but as you can see, it actually applied it to our entire image. It was a global effect, and that's certainly not something that I wanted. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to come up here and we're going to mask, and we're going to go to invert mask. Now this basically removes the entire filter of whatever we just applied, and if you're familiar with Photoshop layers, I basically created a black slate over the layer, basically taking the opacity down to 0, so none of the effect is actually penetrating through to the rest of our image and the layers that we can see over here on the right. So what I want to do is actually just come over here and go to the masking brush. I want to click on perfect brush, which is basically an auto masking brush, which means that it's pulling in just the pixels and just applying the edit that we're trying to add into this image, specifically to the pixels around the center of this piece. And we're going to go ahead and make this just a little bit bigger, so it's a little bit more obvious for everyone to see. Let's go ahead and do 350. Yeah, that's pretty good. Now what I want to do is I actually just want to make it a little bit more of a warmer tone for the moss areas that are on the top of this canyon. So now that we've inverted our mask, we've selected the masking brush, now actually all we're doing is we're actually just painting it in. Now it's applying it for 100%, as you can see down here, and that's okay. I'm leaving it at 100% so I can distinctly tell what the effect is. So let's go ahead and just paint it in a little bit. It's not going to look so great again because it's at 100%. We're going to scale that back. This just allows us to figure out where we want to paint it and where it's going to make the most sense for everything else. In some areas we might need to pull back just a little bit more than it actually is, but that's okay. So there we go. So now it's painted in, it's very obvious where this is being painted, so let's go ahead and just pull this back. So this is with nothing, with none of the effect. So again, zero effect, zero amount being applied. And now you can see it's just warming it up just a tone, just a little bit. I think about 34 looks about where I'm happy. That looks about good. Now what I probably want to do now is I really like it up here, but it's starting to protrude a little bit more into the mist area. So what we can just do is come over here and click paint out. Now we're just going to paint out some of this a little bit, just so that it's not so obvious. And then we can go back and paint in just to make sure that we're applying it as needed. Now you can also, I'm using actually my my Wacom Cintiq tablet, so you can actually also be using the paintbrush just to paint some of this in, and it bases it off of opacity, or bases off of pressure sensitivity. So the harder I press down, the more opacity it's putting in there. So I can easily just subtly paint that in, which works great. Now this is overall about where I wanted things to be with Perfect Effects. So let's go ahead and apply all of our effects and head back to Photoshop. And then I'll show you the last second stuff that we're going to be doing just to pull out a little bit more detail and just add a little bit tiny more color to the actual water coming off of Gullfoss. So it's just going to take a second as we're applying our effects. It's applying and applying. These are the full resolution files with the 36 megapixel D800, which is why it's actually taking a second. For most of my images shot with the D4 or my Canon 5D Mark III or 1DX, it goes much faster. Okay, so now we're back here in Photoshop. Here's our original image, kind of flat, looks okay. Here's our image with more pop and more style. I like it. So let's go ahead and click File. Let's click Save, which is going to send us back to Lightroom. Now our file has appeared from Photoshop, and here we go. So as we can see from our last image before we had it cropped and everything, that's when we sent it into Photoshop, and this is after we've gotten out of Perfect Effects. So what we're going to do now is just do some last second little cleanups here. What I want to do is a few things. First off, I want to add just a little bit more shadow detail because we made it a little bit darker than I wanted to when we were in when we're using some of the effects with Perfect Effects. So that's just made it a little bit more realistic here. It didn't make it so contrasted with everything else. Now what I also want to do is come down here to the HSL, which is the hue, saturation, and luminance sliders. Now what I want to do is actually use the luminance, and I want to come over here and use our little eyedropper. And I want to basically increase the luminance just a touch for a few of these specific areas, a few of the darker areas. It's just adding a little bit more color. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go back into the saturation, do the same thing, which basically means that we increase the luminance, we increase the brightness of those specific pixels of those color gamuts, and now we're going to go back in and just add a little bit more pop to these colors, just to have them pop up a tiny bit more. Okay, overall that was pretty good. Now I actually just want to come in and actually do what it was blue. Okay, perfect. So what we're going to do as a last second touch is that you see there's a lot more blue hue now that has come across this kind of back end of the canyon. That was because we were doing some global adjustments right then when we were increasing luminance and saturation. So we're going to come into the localize adjustment brush. So the nice little trick is you just come down here and you select show selected mask overlay, and then you paint in with no effects. And basically what it does is it's going to show you where the effects are going to be applied once you actually take the time. You do want auto masks normally selected. I just did that a little bit late, but that's okay. So what I'm just doing is selecting this general area. Now we're going to go ahead and unclick the show selected mask, and all I want to do is actually just remove some of the saturation. That's going to hopefully just remove some of the saturation of the blue. So this is standard. You see it's a very bluish tone. Now we're going to do a negative saturation. It's about -31 is pretty good for me. That way you can still see some of the color of the moss here. We're not removing all of the color, we're just kind of trying to take away a little bit of the blue saturation that was added to our image here. And now we're done. I want to thank everyone for listening. I really hope that when you guys head out into the field next, that you really think about simplifying your compositions. Try using lenses that you might normally not normally use for a given situation, such as your 70-200 when you're doing landscape work, and really try to get in and capture a little bit more intimate aspects of your scenes. And this will help you remove some of those distractions that you might automatically be brought into the frame if you'd use a wider angle lens. So thank you again. Thank you On One Software, and I hope you enjoyed it.